Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our podcast. We are the Social Work Sisters. I am your host, Haley,
And I'm your host, Molly.
and this week we will be analyzing the book Breaking the Ocean by Anahid Dashgard.
This book highlights the oppression experienced by mixed race minority groups, specifically the disparities that we as a Canadian society perpetuate and privilege. One academic article that we found from our anti racism and social work class called The Effective Countering Islamophobia Strategies in the Digital Age highlights that one of the most serious challenges, which is still threatening Muslims globally, is the surge of Islamophobia, or negative attitudes and excessive fear towards Islam and Muslims. This relates directly back to themes in Breaking the Ocean that we will be discussing today. When looking further into this in relation to Breaking the Ocean, we found first-hand accounts of students at the University of Toronto in an academic article called Islamophobia in Canada. Muslim students share their personal experiences. One woman said a stranger in her car called her a terrorist and tried to run her over. Another said someone tried to pull her hijab off on the subway. And one participant even reported being groped at a party by a man who said, "If I do this to you, will your dad blow up my house?" One question I wanted to bring up today to get your opinion on was, how did Anahid's experiences shape her sense of self and justice, and how did her parents' experiences differ?
Well, I noticed that a really common theme throughout the book was that she faced a lot of racism throughout her life, leading her to want to advocate and protest.
Yeah, for sure. She also witnessed racism her father and siblings had to endure, and how it compared and contrasted from her mother's. For example, she's quoted in the book, "At a young age, I became conscious of the dynamic of power, how to identify it, who possessed it, and later, how to attain it."
Her father, in Iran, came from a large family of seven. They did not have much money whatsoever. He worked extremely hard to put himself through college and university by having straight A grades and winning a scholarship to become the Auditor General of Iran. When moving to Britain for school, he met her mother, and she lived in a small town called Skellingthorpe. She had a small family, lived in a wealthy upper class family. Both of their lives severely contrasted from each other, as the mother, who had not very many hardships in terms of power, privilege, and oppression, whereas the father had to work from the ground up to create that privilege for himself. They first
Hmm.
moved to Britain together, where her father was treated what I would say is humanely. However, when they moved to Canada, that all changed for them, except the mother, who was able to make the change without issue. She watched as her father was shunned for being himself, more specifically for not being white. She watched as he went from a powerful business mogul to being put into the less than bracket that we as a Canadian society perpetrate against Islamic cultures. Her mother, on the other hand, no matter where she went, was embraced culturally when her father was struggling. And he'd watched as these differences continued throughout her life, and she noticed how her father reacted to these racisms, and it seems as though that her parents' experiences severely shaped her own in terms of how she reacted to these racisms. One
For
question
sure.
that I wanted to bring up was, where do we see systems of oppression operating in the book?
Wow, there are so many different areas that I see systems of oppression operating throughout the entire story.
Me too.
One that I wanted to bring up was how when they came into Canada, the Conservative government was the party in power. And at the time, the Prime Minister was Stephen Harper, my apologies, and he was in the office. Anna Heed on page 33 describes this as um,
She described this brand of conservatism espoused with traditional uh, or more or less religious family values.
and viewed foreigners with suspicion. New immigrants stood out, non-white immigrants even more so. People could be friendly but still look to you suspiciously or put a polite face while holding the door closed to the club. Census data shows that visible minority immigrants still made up a relatively small percent of Canada's total population in the early 1980s, as just 5%.
Um, in our book, we were able to determine many different correlations between the course content as well. Mullally, which is the author of our course textbook, um, was able to clearly outline the different forms of oppression, and the two that we felt most correlated with her father's experience was exploitation and marginalization.
Yeah.
Mullally defines, exploitation as the social process whereby the dominant group is able to accumulate and maintain status, power, and assets from the energy and labor expended by subordinate groups. Mullally further defined marginalization as primarily affecting people of color, old age, and young people, many single mothers and their children, physically and mentally disabled people, unskilled workers, and Indigenous people. Where we saw a direct correlation between the book and course content was Enahid on page 62, describing how her father rose from extreme poverty to become the Auditor General of Iran, only to face racial discrimination on the other side of the ocean in the lower ranks of provincial government office. He went from making the rules in Iran, which is social privilege, to being a racial minority in Canada, unable to deviate from a single social norm, which is oppression.
Her father, having a high ranking education, could get jobs in Iran, Britain, but then when moving to Canada, wasn't able to get interviews for entry level jobs. Another quote from our textbook was that privilege at the cultural level consists of values, norms, and shared patterns of seeing, thinking, and acting, along with an assumed consensus about what is right and normal, that taken together endorse the belief in a superior culture. An example of cultural privilege occurs when the dominant religious group, for example, Christians, has its religion recognized and celebrated with a host of holidays, which was on page 46. Um, One quote that we found from the book that Anahid said on page 45 was that my mother saw others' poor treatment of me through the lens of childhood bullying, not as a systematic rejection of a brown body in a sea of whiteness. Hey, social work sister, did anything surprise or challenge you?
A lot surprised and challenged me throughout this book, actually. The first one, though, was when Anahid returned to her school, and she was talking to a staff member from the school, and she was explaining the extreme racism she experienced and bullying. And the staff member just sat there, blank faced, and did not say anything. There was no attempt to console her, to say, I'm so sorry that that happened to you. That sounds awful. She didn't try to put her mind at ease in the sense that, the bullying rates have gone down since you've graduated. And I thought that that was honestly quite appalling, at the lack of empathy that was given towards her after being so vulnerable. What
For
surprised or
sure.
challenged you?
I thought that whole thing was just really disgusting and really saddening. Another area that really shocked me when I was reading this book was that when she was in school and hearing about all the how the children teased and bullied her at such a young age, whether it was that she stinks, she's gross, she's weird, taunting her, chasing her, and yelling, Packy, Packy, this was so disheartening to hear, and I was shocked that children, especially at the young age of 7, were already introduced to this language and behavior. This is the type of implicit bias that is something that is integrated throughout infancy and like youth and your childhood, with which is what shocked me the most.
That is extremely shocking, and I completely agree. On the other hand, we noticed that her minority and her diversity was used as a weapon against her when she was
Yeah,
working for a nonprofit. They essentially used her as a, hey, look, we aren't racist. We hired a brown person.
exactly.
And this is like not only an attempt at an empty gesture, but it's also extremely disturbing, and it's almost like dangling a piece of cheese in front of a mouse, or the phenomenon of a black sheep. They hired her on bad intentions. They hired her on the basis of never planning on listening to her or allowing for her to try and make opportunities to make a difference for people of Islamic faith. Instead, they taunted her with the idea of being able to make a difference, which is virtually impossible in a world full of power hungry people. We recognized that there was clear implicit bias throughout not only this specific scenario, but also the scenario that Molly had just talked about previously, with the children that were taunting her ruthlessly.
Yeah.
Molly describes, or I'm so sorry, Waddell describes implicit bias, which is an unconscious, subtle, automatic attitude or stereotype that influence perception, judgment, behavior, often without conscious awareness. Um, and the example that we used from this, or for this, I'm so sorry, from the book was from page 47 when Anahid described her experience on a Girl Guides trip. The guide leader immediately disliked me. She made a habit of ignoring me, overlooking me when it came time to assign tasks, and openly belittling me in front of other girls. Hey, Molly, how might this story shift our future as social workers?
To shift like my future approach as a social worker, and I think we agreed on this, is to definitely be using an anti-oppressive practice and the importance of that. We found a study from an academic article um, titled Individualized Anti-Oppressive Practice Coaching, a pilot study on anti-oppressive practice in social work education. This quote states that this is a pre-experimental pilot study details the application of a novel anti-oppressive coaching model and process to advance learning outcomes among social work students, shows that the integrated systems anti-oppressive practice model and individualized anti-oppressive practice coaching may show effective use as an intervention in social work diversity curriculum among social work students and education and training contexts. So I just think it's so important to be able to use this practice on anyone you're working with throughout our careers as social workers.
Overall, this book has taught us a lot about the different levels of oppression and how it affects other people. We both want to recognize that we are white women who may not, we know we won't experience the same um, experiences, I guess, as Anahid, and we just wanted to show appreciation for her vulnerability throughout the story. Um, Thank you guys so much for listening to our podcast. We are the Social Work Sisters.